The sleet came sideways that afternoon, and Lady Arabella Voss's traveling coach chose that precise moment to lose a wheel. She heard it before she felt it, a crack like a rifle shot beneath her feet, then the lurch, the tilt, and the sudden violent intimacy of the carriage floor rising to meet her. She caught herself against the opposite seat, hands splayed, heart hammering, and sat very still while the vehicle groaned to a stop at an angle that suggested it would not be moving again without considerable assistance. Her maid, Dotty, let out a sound that was not quite a scream. "We're alive," Arabella said, more to herself than to Dotty. She pressed her face to the window. Sleet streaked the glass, and beyond it she could see nothing but grey fields and the suggestion of a road that had, until recently, been taking her away from her stepmother's house and toward her cousin's, where she had been informed, not asked, informed, that she would spend the next 3 months helping to manage the children. 7 years. 7 years of managing other people's children, other people's households, other people's lives. 7 years of making herself small enough to be useful and quiet enough to be forgotten. And now the carriage had broken down 3 miles from anywhere, in November, in sleet, and Arabella was beginning to suspect that the universe had a very particular sense of humor. The coachman appeared at the door, hat in hand, water streaming from his brow. "Wheels gone, my lady. Clean off. I'll need to ride for help. There's a village, I think, 2 miles east." "You think," Arabella repeated. "I'm fairly certain, my lady." She looked at Dotty, who had gone the color of old linen. She looked at the sleet. She looked at the angle of the carriage and calculated, with the quiet mathematical precision she had developed over 7 years of managing everything no one else wanted to manage, that they could be here for a very long time. "Go," she said. "We'll wait." The coachman went. The sleet intensified. Arabella pulled her cloak tighter, settled back against the tilted seat with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford, and waited. She had been waiting approximately 20 minutes when she heard hoofbeats. She pressed her face to the glass again and saw through the sleet a single rider pulling up alongside the stricken carriage. A large horse, a large man, dark coat, no hat, which struck her as either very brave or very foolish in this weather. He dismounted with the ease of someone who had been doing so since before he could walk, and then he was at her door, and she was looking at a face she did not recognize. He was, she registered with the detached clarity of someone who had no business noticing such things, extraordinarily handsome, dark hair plastered to his forehead by the sleet, strong jaw, eyes that were an unusual shade of gray, almost silver, and currently fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately read. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was low and direct, with no preamble. "No," she said. "The wheel is gone. My coachman has gone for help. The village is 2 miles east. He'll be at least 2 hours. He glanced at the angle of the carriage, the sleet, the sky, which was darkening toward something worse. "There's a coaching inn 3 miles north. I'll take you." Arabella looked at him steadily. "I don't know you." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense, exactly. Something closer to surprise, as if he was not accustomed to being reminded of that particular fact. "No," he agreed. "You don't." He paused. "I am Ashford." She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. The Duke of Ashford was one of the wealthiest men in England, a figure of considerable power, and if the whispers of the drawing-room she had spent 7 years moving through invisibly were to be believed, considerable coldness. He was not the sort of man who stopped for stranded travelers. He was the sort of man other men got out of the way of. "You're the Duke of Ashford," she said. "I am." "And you want to take me to a coaching inn?" "I want to take you somewhere that isn't a tilted carriage in a sleet storm," he said. "You may do what you like with the destination." Arabella considered him for a moment longer. He was still standing in the sleet. He had not moved to open the door without her permission. He was waiting, she realized. Actually waiting. With a patience that sat strangely on someone who looked like he had never waited for anything in his life. "My maid comes with me," she said. "Of course." She opened the door herself. The 3 miles to the coaching inn were the strangest of Arabella's recent memory, which was saying something, because her recent memory included 7 years of strangeness. Ashford had sent his horse on ahead, with a groom who had materialized from somewhere behind him, and now the 3 of them, Duke, lady, and maid, were crowded into a hired conveyance that smelled of damp wool and someone else's journey, and the sleet hammered the roof like an argument that refused to be resolved. Dottie had fallen asleep within minutes, exhausted by the shock of the wheel. Arabella sat across from Ashford and watched him not look at her. He was looking out the window. His jaw was set. There was something careful about him, she thought. Something deliberate in the way he held himself, as if he had learned very early that the space he occupied needed to be precisely managed. "You didn't have to stop," she said. He looked at her then, those gray eyes, direct and unreadable. "No," he agreed. "Then why did you?" The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It was more like a room being rearranged. "You were alone," he said finally, "in a broken carriage, in November." People are alone in broken carriages in November with some regularity. "Perhaps I have poor judgment," he said, and something in his voice was very nearly dry. Arabella looked at him for a moment. "That is not what people say about you." "What do people say about me?" "That you are precise," she said, "controlled, that you do nothing without purpose." He held her gaze. "Then perhaps I had a purpose." "Which was?" The carriage hit a rut, and the lamp swayed, and for a moment the shadow shifted across his face in a way that made him look less like a duke and more like a man. Just a man, tired and wet and doing something he could not entirely explain. "I don't know yet," he said, and then he looked back out the window, and the conversation was over, and Arabella sat with those 4 words and felt, for reasons she could not name, that they were the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. The coaching inn was called the White Hart, and it was warm. That was the first thing Arabella noticed. The warmth, the low golden light, the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. After the tilted carriage and the sleet and 7 years of cold houses where she was tolerated rather than welcomed, the warmth hit her like something physical. She stood in the doorway for a moment too long, just breathing it in. Ashford spoke quietly to the innkeeper. Rooms were procured, separate, she noted, and was grateful for it, and then felt oddly aware of having noted it at all. Dottie was settled with tea and a fire, and the immediate unconsciousness of the truly exhausted, and Arabella found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, sitting across a small table from the Duke of Ashford in the inn's private parlor, with a fire and 2 cups of tea between them, and the sleet still raging outside. "You never told me your name," he said. "You never asked." Another almost pause. "What is your name?" "Arabella Voss. Lady Arabella, technically, though it's been some time since anyone troubled to use the title." She said it without bitterness, or tried to. She was not certain she succeeded. Something moved across his face. "Sometime," he repeated. "My father remarried when I was 15. My stepmother has 3 daughters of her own." She lifted her cup. I became rather surplus to requirements. And now you're traveling to your cousin's to manage her children for 3 months. She met his eyes over the rim of her cup. I am very good at managing things that belong to other people. The fire popped. The sleet hammered. Ashford was watching her with that same careful, direct attention he had given her in the carriage, the look of a man who was not looking through her, or past her, but at her, specifically, with a focus that was simultaneously unnerving, and she was ashamed to admit, something close to a relief. "How old are you?" he asked. 22. "And in those 22 years, has anyone ever asked what you wanted?" The question landed with the quiet force of something thrown from a great height. Arabella set down her cup very carefully. "That is an unusual question." "Yes," he agreed. "Has anyone?" She thought about it honestly, which was perhaps a mistake, because the honest answer was no. Not her father, not her stepmother, not her cousin, not the succession of households that had passed her between them like a useful piece of furniture. "No," she said. "Not that I can recall." Ashford nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "What do you want, Lady Arabella?" She laughed, a small surprise sound that she hadn't intended. "I want the wheel to be fixed." Beyond that, she looked at him across the firelight. He was serious, completely, entirely serious, asking her a question that no one had ever thought to ask, in an inn in the middle of a sleet storm, with the patience of a man who would wait as long as it took for an honest answer. "I want," she said slowly, "to stop being useful and start being—" She stopped. The word felt dangerous. "Present," she finished. "I want to be present somewhere, to matter to a place, not just to its running." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it, warmer somehow, more inhabited. "That seems," Ashford said carefully, "like a reasonable thing to want. It seems like an impossible thing to have. Most reasonable things do, at first." He looked into the fire for a moment. When he looked back at her, his expression had shifted into something she couldn't name. Careful and deliberate, and underneath it, something raw. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Arabella," she went still. "I beg your pardon?" "A legitimate one," he said, and there was something almost wry in his voice, as if he understood precisely how that had sounded. "I am in need of a—" He paused, choosing the word. "A companion, for my grandmother. She is elderly, sharp-tongued, and has driven off 3 paid companions in as many months. She requires someone with patience and spine in equal measure." Arabella stared at him. "You're offering me employment." "I'm offering you a position in my household," he said. "Which is different. My grandmother's companion is not a servant. She dines with the family. She is presented in society. She is—" Another pause. "Present." That word, her word, returned to her. "Why?" she asked. The old question, the one she always came back to. "Why would you do this? You don't know me. We met an hour ago in a sleet storm." Ashford held her gaze. "I told you. I don't know yet." "That is not a satisfying answer." "No," he agreed, "but it's the true one." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and the firelight caught the planes of his face and made him look, again, less like a duke and more like a man who was doing something he hadn't planned and wasn't entirely sure of. "Come to Ashford Park, give it a month. If you're miserable, I'll arrange your passage to your cousins myself, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." Arabella looked at him for a long moment. The fire, the sleet, the warmth of a room that was not hers and a cup of tea she hadn't had to arrange herself, the word present hanging in the air between them. 1 month, she said. 1 month. And your grandmother is truly terrible? Something happened to his mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the suggestion that a smile was possible and had perhaps been, once, a regular occurrence. Magnificently so, he said. Arabella nodded. All right, she said. 1 month. She did not sleep well that night, which she attributed to the strangeness of the day and absolutely nothing else. Ashford Park was not what she had expected, which was foolish, because she should have expected something extraordinary, and she had instead expected something merely large. It was both large and extraordinary, and set against a November sky, like something out of a painting that hadn't been painted yet. Gray stone and tall windows and a drive lined with oaks that were bare now, but would be, she found herself thinking, magnificent in spring. She was thinking about spring at Ashford Park before she had even stepped inside it. She noted this, filed it away under things not to examine too closely, and followed the Duke through the front doors. The Dowager Duchess of Ashford was waiting in the blue drawing room, and she was everything her grandson had promised. She was small and ancient, and sat in her chair like a queen who had simply decided that thrones were beneath her. Her eyes were the same unusual gray as Ashford's, and they fixed on Arabella the moment she entered the room with an attention that was, if anything, more direct than her grandson's. So, the Dowager said, "You're the girl from the carriage." "I am," Arabella said, "and you're the grandmother who frightened off 3 companions." A beat of silence. Ashford, somewhere behind her, went very still. The Dowager's mouth curved. "I like her," she said to no one in particular. "Sit down, girl. You look like you've been traveling in a sleet storm." "I have been," Arabella said, and sat. What followed was the strangest and, she would later think, the most important conversation of her life. The Dowager talked about the house, about the family, about the season past and the season coming. She talked about Arabella's mother, which startled her, because the Dowager had known her mother, had been a friend of sorts, had thought very highly of her. And then she said, quite casually, as if it were nothing, "Your mother wrote to you, you know, in the early years, after the remarriage." Arabella's breath stopped. "I never received any letters." The Dowager's expression did not change, but something in it hardened. "No," she said, "I don't imagine you did." The implication settled over Arabella like cold water. 7 years. 7 years of silence she had attributed to indifference, to being forgotten, to being the kind of person who was easy to leave, and it had been none of those things. It had been interception. It had been deliberate. She sat very still, the way she had learned to sit when something was too large to process, and she needed time to make it smaller. Later that evening, Ashford found her in the library. She had not planned to be in the library. She had planned to be in her room, in bed, processing in private. But the library had been warm, and the books had been real, and there had been a fire, and she had sat down for a moment, and then simply stayed, because the room felt like something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. He came in quietly. He did not seem surprised to find her there. He settled into the chair across from hers and looked at the fire for a moment before he spoke. "She told you about the letters," he said. "Yes." "I'm sorry. Did you know?" He looked at her then. "No. I found out only recently. It was part of why—" He stopped, started again. "It was part of why I stopped." Arabella looked at him. The fire was burning low, and the room was very quiet. and he looked, in this light, like a man who had put down something heavy and wasn't sure what to do with his hands now that they were empty. "You stopped for me specifically," she said slowly. "You knew who I was. I had heard your name. I knew your situation." His jaw tightened. "I had been to your father's house some months ago, on other business. I saw—" He paused. "I saw how things were." She thought about her father's house, the pale colors her stepmother insisted upon, the way she was seated at the far end of the table, the way guests looked through her. "And you decided to rescue me," she said, and was surprised by the edge in her own voice. "I decided to offer you a choice," he said, "which is different." "Is it?" "Rescue implies helplessness," he said. "You are not helpless, Lady Arabella. You are—" He seemed to search for the word. "Contained. By circumstance, not by nature. There is a difference." The fire popped. The silence stretched. Arabella looked at this man who had stopped in a sleet storm and offered her a word she had given him, present, and felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked for a long time turning. "I'm frightened," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. Of what? Of wanting this. She gestured vaguely. The room, the warmth, the fire, the conversation. Of letting myself be present somewhere, and then having it taken away. Ashford leaned forward. His elbows were on his knees, his gray eyes intent on her face. And when he spoke, his voice was low and careful and entirely honest. "I cannot promise you it won't be difficult," he said. "There will be people who object, your stepmother, society, my own." He stopped. "There will be complications, but I can promise you that I will not take it away. That is not something I am willing to do." "You don't know me well enough to promise that." "No," he said, "but I know enough." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire, his face, the gray eyes that had never once, in all of their strange hours together, looked through her or past her. "Tell me something true," she said, "something you haven't told anyone." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been running this estate, this family, this title since I was 19 years old. My father died and left me everything, and I have spent 8 years being precisely what everyone needed me to be." He looked at the fire. "I am very tired of being precisely what everyone needs." The words landed quietly and stayed. "What would you be," she asked, "if you could be anything else?" He looked back at her, and something in his expression was very nearly unguarded. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't let myself think about it." "That seems like a reasonable thing to want," she said, and gave him his own words back, and watched something happen in his face. A softening, a recognition, the ghost of that almost smile becoming something more real. "Yes," he said softly, "I suppose it does." She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his. It was an impulsive thing, a small thing, and she felt him go very still beneath her touch, not pulling away but absorbing it, as if physical kindness were something he had to translate before he could receive it. They sat like that until the fire burned to embers, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most comfortable silence Arabella had ever sat in. The weeks that followed were, in the vocabulary of Arabella's previous life, entirely without precedent. She had a room that was hers, not a guest room held in trust for someone more important, not a corner carved out of necessity, but a room that the dowager had chosen specifically, with windows that faced east and a writing desk and curtains, in a deep, particular blue that made Arabella feel every morning when she opened her eyes that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her. there was a wardrobe. The dowager had arranged it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided something and saw no reason to delay. Silks and wool and muslin in colors that were. Arabella stood in front of the mirror and couldn't speak for a moment. Colors that were actually her colors, deep blue and forest green and a wine red, that made her look, for the first time in 7 years, like herself, like the self she had been before the pale lavenders and washed-out creams her stepmother had chosen for her, colors that drained her face and made her easy to overlook. She chose those colors deliberately, the dowager said from behind her, without preamble. Your stepmother, colors that diminish, it's a very old trick. Arabella looked at her reflection. I didn't know, she said. You weren't meant to. She wore the blue dress to dinner that night, and when she came down the stairs and into the dining room, Ashford looked up from his correspondence and went entirely still. His eyes traveled from her face to the gown and back, and the expression on his face was something she had no framework for, something careful and arrested, and underneath the careful, something that burned. You look, he started. Different, she said. No, he said. You look like yourself. She sat down before he could see what that did to her face. The days accumulated. She read to the dowager in the mornings and walked the grounds in the afternoons, learning the estate the way she had learned every household she had passed through, by its rhythms, its sounds, the way the light moved through its rooms at different hours. But this learning was different. She was not cataloging it in order to manage it. She was learning it because she wanted to know it, because she thought, with a hope she kept carefully contained, that she might be allowed to know it for a long time. Ashford was there in the evenings, always. The library, the drawing room, the long dinners where the dowager retired early and left them with the fire and the wine and the particular electricity of two people who were not speaking about the thing they were both thinking about. He was, as she had been warned, controlled, precise and careful, and unfailingly courteous. But the control had cracks in it now, and she could see through them to something warmer and more uncertain, and she found to her own alarm that she was always looking for the cracks. He had a habit of watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She had a habit of pretending she wasn't looking when she was. They were, she thought, very badly matched in their attempts at subtlety. The letter from her stepmother arrived on a Tuesday. It was not a request. It was a command, dressed in the language of concern. Arabella's reputation, the impropriety of her situation, the Duke's intentions, the family's worry. Underneath the language of concern was the language of control, and underneath that was something Arabella recognized from 7 years of living in the same house: fear. Her stepmother was afraid of what Arabella becoming visible might mean for the careful architecture of the life she had built on Arabella's invisibility. She brought the letter to Ashford. He read it in silence. His jaw tightened incrementally as he read, and by the time he set it down, his expression was the one she thought of as his Duke face, the one that could have frozen the fire in the grate. She wants you to return, he said. Yes. And if you don't? She will write to your grandmother, to society. She will suggest that my presence here is, Arabella chose the word carefully, irregular. Ashford looked at her. Is that what you're afraid of? Her letters? I'm afraid of what they'll cost you, she said. Your reputation, your standing. I am not. She stopped, started again. I am not worth that. He stood up. He crossed the room in 4 deliberate steps and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, and the expression on his face was nothing like the Duke face now. It was raw and direct and entirely unguarded. "Do not," he said quietly, "tell me what you are worth. Ashford, you have been told for 7 years that you are worth less than the space you occupy. You have been told it so consistently that you believe it." His voice was low and rough at the edges. "I am telling you that you are wrong, and I am asking you very sincerely to let me show you how wrong." She looked up at him. The fire, the letter on the desk, his face so close, so unguarded, so entirely different from the controlled man she had met in a sleet storm 3 weeks ago. "Why?" she asked. The old question, the only question. "Because," he said, and his voice cracked, just slightly, at the edge of the word. "You matter to me, already, more than I know what to do with. And I would rather face every letter your stepmother can write than spend another day pretending that isn't true." The silence that followed was very full. "That is," she said carefully, "a great deal to say to someone you've known for 3 weeks. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." "Are you certain?" "I am," he said, "more certain of this than I have been of anything in 8 years of running a dukedom." She looked at him for a long moment, his gray eyes, intent and raw and waiting, his hands at his sides, very still, the way they were when he was holding himself carefully, and she thought about the letter, and her stepmother's fear, and 7 years of being contained by circumstance, and the word present, and the blue dress, and the fire burning low in the library at 2 in the morning, and his hand beneath hers, absorbing kindness like a man learning a new language. "All right," she said. "All right?" "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm not going back. And if she writes to your grandmother or to society or to the king himself, then—" She took a breath. "Then we face it. Together." Something happened in his face then. A release, a lightness, as if a weight had been set down that had been carried for a very long time. He reached up and took her face in his hands, and his thumbs were warm against her cheeks, and he looked at her with an expression that she had no word for except chosen. "Together," he said. He kissed her gently, and the fire burned, and the letter lay forgotten on the desk. The stepmother came, of course. They always came. She arrived 3 days later in a carriage that announced itself before it appeared, and she swept into Ashford Park's front hall with the particular energy of a woman who had decided she was still in charge. She had brought Arabella's father, which was either strategy or cruelty, possibly both. He stood behind his wife with the expression of a man who had been defeated so long ago that he had forgotten what winning felt like. Arabella met them in the drawing-room. She wore the wine-red dress. She stood beside Ashford, and she did not make herself small. "You will come home," her stepmother said, after the pleasantries had been dispensed with, in approximately 30 seconds. "This arrangement is inappropriate. It reflects badly on the family. It reflects badly on you." "Which family?" Arabella asked. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "You have spent 7 years making very clear that I am not part of yours." Her stepmother's expression flickered. "Arabella, you intercepted my mother's letters." The words came out quietly, without drama, which was somehow worse than if she had shouted them. "For years, you let me believe she had forgotten me, and she hadn't. She was writing to me, and you were taking the letters, and you never told me." The silence in the room was absolute. Her father made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man hearing something he had suspected and never allowed himself to confirm. "That is," her stepmother began. "True, Arabella said. "It is true, and you know it is true, and I know it is true, and the Duke of Ashford knows it is true, and if you would like to discuss which of us has the more precarious social position at this moment, I am prepared to have that conversation." Her stepmother looked back at her with the expression that could freeze fire, and said nothing, which was, Arabella had come to understand, his most devastating weapon. "You would destroy your own daughter's reputation," her stepmother said, pivoting, "staying here, unmarried, in a bachelor's household." "Then marry her," said the dowager. Everyone turned. The dowager had entered from the side door with the silent efficiency of a woman who had been listening from the corridor for the past several minutes and had decided the moment had arrived. She settled into her chair with the composure of someone presiding over a meeting she had called. "The solution is obvious," she said. "It has been obvious for some weeks. Ashford will marry the girl. The gossip becomes a love story. Everyone is satisfied." She looked at her grandson. "Well?" Ashford looked at Arabella. Arabella looked at Ashford. "I had planned," he said, with a slight edge that suggested he had, in fact, planned something rather more romantic than this, "to ask you privately." "You were taking too long," his grandmother said. He exhaled, and then he turned to face Arabella fully, and the Duke face was entirely gone, and what was left was just the man, the tired, careful, warm man who had stopped in a sleet storm because he couldn't not stop, who had given her back her own word, who had sat with her in a dying fire and told her the truth about himself. "I love you, Hilla," he said, simply, directly, as if it were a fact he was reporting rather than a confession he was making. "I know that it has been a short time, and I know that the circumstances have been irregular, and I know that you have every reason not to trust it. But I love you, and I would like, very much, to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be invisible again." He paused. "Will you marry me, Arabella?" She was aware of the room, her stepmother's stillness, her father's bowed head, the dowager's fierce, bright gaze. She was aware of the fire and the gray November light through the tall windows, and the wine-red dress, and the blue curtains upstairs in the room that had been waiting for her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." Her stepmother left without saying goodbye. Her father at the door turned back once and looked at her with an expression that was too complicated, and too late, and too much to deal with today. "Arabella," he said. "I know, Papa," she said quietly. "I know." He nodded and left, and she let him go. The wedding was in January, in the small church on the Ashford estate, with snow on the ground and the dowager in the front pew, wearing an expression of profound satisfaction. Arabella walked the aisle alone, because she had decided she preferred it that way. She was not being given by anyone, to anyone. She was arriving of her own accord. Ashford was waiting at the altar, and when he saw her, his face did the thing it did, the thing she had come to think of as the only expression that was entirely his, unguarded and warm, and a little overwhelmed, as if the fact of her still surprised him, even now. They had written their own vows, which the vicar had found irregular, and the dowager had found sensible. "I vow to see you," Ashford said, "not the version of you that is useful to others, or convenient to circumstance. You, all of you. I vow to keep seeing you for as long as I live." Arabella looked at him, and felt the last of the careful armor she had built over 7 years simply fall away, quietly, without drama, like a coat she no longer needed. "I vow to be present," she said, "here, with you, not managing from the edges but standing in the center of my own life." Her voice was steady. I vow to let you see me, all of me, even the parts I have spent years making small. Especially those parts, he said softly, and the vicar cleared his throat, and the dowager made a sound that was absolutely not a sniffle. 2 years later, Arabella sat in the library at Ashford Park, her library, her chair, her fire, and listened to the snow falling outside the windows. The estate was quiet in the particular way it was quiet in winter, a deep and settled quiet that felt like contentment rather than emptiness. Ashford came in and sat across from her, and she looked up from her book, and he looked at her with the expression she would never stop being grateful for. "She's asleep," he said, meaning their daughter. Eleanor, they had named her, after Arabella's mother. Ellie, in practice, who was 18 months old and had her father's gray eyes and her mother's habit of regarding the world with a directness that suggested she had already decided most of it would have to justify itself. "Tell me again," Arabella said. It was a ritual they had, a game they played in quiet moments, the retelling of the beginning. He would tell her about the sleet and the broken wheel, and the woman sitting in a tilted carriage, with her hands flat on the opposite seat, and her chin lifted, waiting. She would tell him about the rider with no hat and the gray eyes, and the 4 words, "I don't know yet," that had been the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. "It was November," he said. "The sleet was coming sideways. And you stopped," she said. "I stopped." He looked at her across the firelight. "I don't know what I expected. You said you didn't know yet. I didn't." He reached across and took her hand. The way he always did, the way she had come to understand, was not a gesture but a statement, a daily, deliberate choosing. And then I did. Outside, the snow fell on the oaks that were bare now but would be, in spring, magnificent. Inside, the fire burned, and Eleanor slept, and Arabella sat in her chair in her library in her life, present and seen and chosen, and felt nothing that resembled invisible at all. Thank you for staying with Arabella and Ashford until the very end. Their story began in a sleet storm with a broken wheel and a question no one had ever thought to ask, and became something neither of them expected, a love built on honesty, on choosing, on the radical act of being truly seen. If their story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath at a fire burning low, or a word returned across a table, I hope you'll subscribe and ring the bell, because there are more impossible loves and more hard-won choices waiting, and I would very much like to share them with you. You are the reason these stories exist. Thank you for being here.